After putting it off for a very long time, I have finally drafted some new pants, and I figured it would be useful to make a video about it. I'm making two different pants drafts, one from the course I took in college and one from a 1917 book. The school one's in metric and the 1917 one is imperial. And then I'm going to make those basic blocks into usable patterns for the kind of fall front pants I like to wear. I know a lot of people are scared of pattern drafting, but it's really not scary. If you mess up, all you've lost is a bit of time and paper, and you can just try again. Any major mistakes should be pretty obvious before you even get to the mock-up stage. I messed up the 1917 draft twice, but I just did it again and it was fine. For anyone worried about math, I understand. I also tend to avoid math, but there is nothing more complicated here than adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing. You only have to do it to one pair of numbers at a time, and if you're watching this on the internet, you have access to a calculator. There may be a lot of numbers, but they're all written down in order, and you've just got to take them one at a time. I usually draw things up based on diagrams of historical patterns, and the last time I followed these instructions was an entire decade ago, so I'm pretty rusty at this kind of pattern drafting. So I was kind of slow, and I messed up some stuff and had to go back and fix it later, but it still worked out fine. I'm starting with the modern pants draft from college. I've put a link in the description to scans of these instructions if you want to try it yourself. I'm told the basic drafts we used were put together from various books. I don't know which specific books, so I don't know who to credit, but I trust that nobody will get mad at me for sharing just this one draft. As with all the patterns we made in college, these blocks have no seam allowance on them, so if you prefer to have the seam allowances included in your pattern, you'll have to add that on afterwards. Before I start on the drafting, I will need to take 6 measurements. I've got a pencil and paper to write them down with, a measuring tape, and some painter's tape to hold the end of it, which is useful if you don't have another person around to help measure. First, I need to tie a piece of yarn around my waist so as to have a consistent mark to reference for the measurements that are taken in relation to the waist. And the waist itself is the first measurement on the list. This should be taken while you are relaxed and standing normally. Mine was 93.5 centimeters. Do not measure it tighter than is comfortable. The goal here is pants that fit. The hip measurement is taken around the widest part of the hips. Mine was 112 centimeters. Also, I forgot to take it at the time because it wasn't listed on the drafting sheet, but it can be helpful to note the distance between the waist and the place you took the hip measurement, which for me was 23 centimeters. Crotch depth is measured by sitting on a hard, flat surface, preferably a chair or a bench, but the floor works too, and measuring from the waist down to that surface. Mine was just a little under 28 centimeters. The waist to knee measurement is one that gets smaller when you bend forward, so don't do that. I'm taping the end of my measuring tape to the middle of my knee and measuring up to the waist from there, making sure to stand normally. 63 centimeters. Pants length is taken from the waist down to wherever you want the hem to be. I'm taping the end of the measuring tape just under my ankle bone and measuring up to my waist from there. 106 centimeters. Hem circumference will depend a lot on personal taste. It could be just the smallest measurement that fits easily over your foot, but I'm making mine somewhat looser at 47 centimeters. For this draft, I'm using some brown paper I got from an estate sale. I prefer to use builder's paper since it's heavier, but my roll ran out and I don't want to go buy a new one when I already have so much other paper. It's awfully tightly curled, so it needed a dry iron. It helps to go through the instructions and do all the math you can before starting, so you have those measurements ready to go and don't have to stop and do them in the middle of drafting. 1/4 my hip measurement is 28 centimeters, plus 1.3 centimeters is 29.3. Crotch line is crotch depth plus 1.3 centimeters, which is also 29.3. AB is 1/4 of the waist, which is 23.4, plus 2.5 is 25.9, so I just rounded it up to 26 centimeters. And somehow I don't have the rest of the footage of me writing these out, but CD is 1/12 the hip, which is 9.3, minus 2 centimeters is 7.3. CE is half of CD, which is 3.7, plus 1.3 centimeters is 5 centimeters. FG is half of CD, which, as mentioned, is 3.7 centimeters. GL is 1/4 of the hip, which is 28, plus 1 is 29 centimeters. Those are all the ones for the front, and for the back instructions, there's only one we can calculate beforehand. RT is 1/4 of the waist plus 2.5, which is the exact same as AB, so that's 26 centimeters again. Now it's time to actually get started. I normally draft with pencils, but sadly those don't show up well on camera, especially from a distance. So just for this video, I'm mostly going to use markers, even though that makes the lines a lot less precise. Ballpoint pen shows up slightly better than pencils, so I do use that a few times, and there are some bits where I forget myself and go back to pencils, but mostly on smaller pieces in close-ups, so it's not too bad. But if you are planning to follow along, it's probably better to watch on a large screen, or just have the instructions and diagrams printed out. First, we must draw a rectangle. The pant length measurement is 106 centimeters, which is the first line that needs to be drawn. Do not do this right up against the edge of the paper. You need a bit of room for things to extend outwards. My longest ruler is just over 60 centimeters, so I drew the first edge of this rectangle with a shelf board. But then I measured and learned the board was only a meter, so I had to move it over to get the remaining 6 centimeters. I really should buy a meter stick. I marked 2 points 106 centimeters apart and squared them up. My grid ruler is only 5 centimeters wide, so I lined up my quilting square with a longer line to make sure it was squared up more accurately. I should perhaps get one of those L-shaped rulers too. On that new line I marked the 29.3 centimeter width, then I did the same on the other end and joined up those two marks to get the final side of my rectangle. The next one to square up is the hip line, and the instructions say 22 centimeters standard, but as mentioned I measured the distance between my waist and where I took my hip measurement and it was 23, so I drew it 23 centimeters down from the top. The line on the left will be the top of the pants. Next is the crotch line, which is 29.3 centimeters down. The thigh line is 8 centimeters below that, though it's not very important. Then the knee line is 63 centimeters down from the top. I was worried the red marker wasn't showing up well enough on camera, so I switched to black Sharpie and went over all my lines again. This corner of the rectangle is A, which is the upper right corner if seen vertically, but it has to be sideways to fit the video better. A to B is that 26 centimeters I calculated earlier, so I'll mark that on there. I marked C on the crotch line at the center front, and D is 7.3 centimeters out from that. Then I was supposed to draw an angle up from C and draw E 5 centimeters away and use that to get the crotch seam, but I appear to have completely ignored that and just drawn it freehand. I went back and measured while writing this, and it's 4.5 centimeters away, so 5 would have been a bit too much. This point here is F, and G is 3.7 centimeters out from that. On the other side, L is 29 centimeters from G. Exactly halfway between G and L is the crease line, which is drawn parallel to those rectangle edges along the whole length of the pant. This line is also the straight of grain. I forgot I was upside down in relation to the camera at first, so I wrote crease line twice. I'm not going to use it as a crease line though, just a grain line. Then the hem is 1/4 of the hem circumference on either side of the crease line, which for me was 11.8 centimeters, or 23.6 for the whole width of the bottom of this front piece. One of these marks is a little ways outside the initial rectangle, but that's perfectly fine. Now I need to join D to G with a straight line and use it as a guide to draw a slight inward curve for the top of the inseam. I drew it lightly in pencil before going over it with marker because I don't want all my curved lines to look horribly messy, but of course if I were not filming it would only be pencil. And G to the hem is connected with another straight line. The outward seam that goes over the hip also needs to be joined up with straight lines, which are then used to draw an outward curve. Once again, I'm doing this in pencil first, but going over it with marker so you can see it better. I never actually used the darts on my final pattern, and I could have just left that extra width out of the waist, but the drafting instructions say to make a dart at the top of the crease line, so I may as well do that. The directions don't specify a length for the front dart, so I made mine 10 centimeters long. Since we added 2.5 centimeters to the waist, that means the dart needs 1.25 centimeters on each side of that center line. And that's everything for the front. Hooray! Now it's time to cut it out. I'm cutting along the outlines everywhere but the top. Since that top edge has a dart, before cutting it needs to be folded in the same way it would lay if sewn, creased down the middle and then folded along one side to face the back. Now I can hold that down with a pattern weight, smooth out the waist curve, and cut along that. Next, it's time to start the back piece. The first step for the back piece is tracing the front piece. I'm using a green marker because I don't want the traced outline to be as dark as the final outlines will be. You also have to transfer all those marks at the sides onto the tracing, so you can add the same horizontal lines, and mark the crease line on too. I noticed the line down the middle of my work table where the two pieces of laminate are joined was just barely visible through the paper, so I was able to line it up with the top and bottom mark and trace along it, rather than using the board again. Also, you're supposed to mark all those letters at the various points again, but it looks like I forgot to do that. It's okay though, they're all right there on the diagram. Turning the front tracing into the back pattern piece is much faster than drafting the front. The butt seam needs a bit more room than the front, so D to N is 6 millimeters. Don't need the top of the front dart, so I'm just crossing that out. This point where the crease line meets the waistline is P, and I need to mark Q 2.5 centimeters away from that, towards the center back. From there, I square up 3.8 centimeters to get R. The next step requires the mark for C, which didn't come over with the tracing, and I had to go and measure so I could transfer it over to the back. Now I join R to C with a straight line and mark S at the halfway point of this line. Sorry that my head was in the way for most of this shot. Also, I should have used a darker marker. Now we need to draw a nice smooth curve from N up to S. The instructions once again reference that E mark that I didn't do, but with the front curve already there, it's easy enough to just draw a shallower curve. Like the other curves, I sketched it out in pencil before going over it with Sharpie. Now I need to extend the waistline out further from the hip side. R to T is 26 centimeters, and to find T I need to line up the starting point of the ruler with R, and make the 26 centimeter mark on the ruler line up with that extended waistline. And there's the back waistline, which is angled up towards the center back because most people are larger on the back than on the front. This line gets a dart the same width as the one on the front, which is located halfway along the waistline. I measured the halfway point and squared down. This time the directions do give a length, and it's 12 centimeters. The dart is 2.5 centimeters wide, so there is once again 1.25 centimeters on each side. H is marked on the hip line, and that line is extended out to U, which is 2 centimeters away. Down by the knee, I've got to mark L and then move out 1 centimeter to X, and on the other side of the knee, it's another 1 centimeters out from G to Y. The width of the hem stays the same. Now the last thing to do is play connect the dots again with the inseam and outseam. These are a lot straighter than the front lines, but you still want that slight inward curve at the top of the inseam. I forgot to mention, you do not have to draw your curves freehand like this. There's a whole bunch of curved rulers out there that are specifically made for pattern drafting, and you can also get flexible rulers for doing any kind of curve. I prefer to draw my curves freehand, but it is absolutely not required. Then I cut the back out, same way as the front, doing the sides and bottom first, folding the dart, and smoothing out the waistline before cutting the extra paper off the top. Here I ended up prematurely finishing the pattern as if it was ready to use, so I'll show that now even though it would have been better a bit later. I'm marking arrows on the ends of the crease lines to indicate that they're the straight of grain. I'm labeling my pieces with the name of the pattern, which piece it is, how many to cut, and the date the pattern was drafted. Sometimes I am bad about labeling my pattern pieces, but in school we were taught to mark all of this on both sides, so I'm doing that here. The grain lines at least really do need to be on both sides. It's important to make sure all the edges that are meant to line up are the same length. In this case, that's the inseam and the outseam. And I need to true the pieces by rolling one edge carefully along the other. I like to do it twice to make sure, just in case the paper slipped. The crotch seams don't need this, because for those you're just sewing the front to the front and the back to the back, so it's the same pattern piece. The side seam did have a slight difference when I got to the bottom, so I marked the difference on the longer side. The other seam also had a slight difference, and the longer edges were both the ones on the back piece, so I joined up those two marks and trimmed the slight bit of extra off the back hem. This is a pattern notcher, which was part of the required supplies for the fashion course. It's useful to have and doesn't cost very much, but you do not need one. It takes a little bite out of the edge of the paper, leaving a nice clear spot to mark while you're tracing onto the fabric. In this case, for the 3 lines of the dart. For the bottom of the dart, I'm folding it along the center line and nipping just a couple millimeters into that folded edge. Now I've got a hole to mark the bottom of the dart through. But, as I said, you do not need a pattern notcher. A pair of paper scissors works perfectly fine. Just cut a small V into the edge of the paper about 2 millimeters wide. The bottom of the dart can be marked in the same way, carefully cutting a small curve into the edge of the fold. You could also use an X-Acto knife, like I did in my leaf kerchief video, just as long as there's a hole big enough to mark through onto the fabric. And now I need to punch holes for hanging. I am punching from the hem because it's plain and has no details that could be messed up if the hole tore. This paper is quite thin, so I'm going to reinforce the edge with tape. I'm punching a couple centimeters in from the edge with my single hole punch, which I think is very useful and worth buying, but it's also not necessary. You could use the end of an ordinary hole punch, but do be sure to reinforce the edge with tape on both sides if you're going to do this, as it will punch very close to the edge. And if you have no kind of punch at all, you can fold the paper and cut out a diamond-shaped hole, but once again you'll need to reinforce it well with tape first. If you don't, the pointy end of that cut will tear right through. But with tape, it should be fine. I hang my patterns on shower hooks because that's the way we did it at school, but some people prefer to fold them up and put them in Ziploc bags. Whatever works for you. It's useful to keep a plastic binder sleeve on the shower hook to hold all the smaller pattern pieces, along with any relevant papers such as pattern alteration notes. But this is not a finished pattern yet, so I should have filmed all those things at a later step. We still have to mock it up and make sure it fits. I'm unrolling my last little bit of cotton muslin and cutting off a piece long enough to fit both pattern pieces on twice. After trying to iron out the worst of the wrinkles, I laid out my pattern pieces and made sure they were on grain. The most accurate way to do this is to measure from the grain line to the selvage and make sure they're the same distance apart on both ends. I traced the outside of the piece, marked the 3 notches on my dart, and marked the dart point through the hole. As mentioned, these pieces have no seam allowance, so I need to leave enough space between the pattern pieces to add that on as I cut. After both pieces were traced, I flipped them over and traced them again. If you want to save on mock-up fabric, you can cut one leg full length and make the other one short. Just make extra sure you're cutting both short pieces for the same leg. I marked the darts on with a ruler and cut everything out with a generous seam allowance. I pinned all the darts, sewed them, and pressed them to the side. I then started pinning the front pieces to the corresponding back pieces. In college, we left the top part of our center back seams open so we could pin them shut while we tried on the mock-up, but for this one I left the top of one side seam open instead, since that's easier to reach on my own. I marked where I wanted to stop on that seam, and then pinned up the rest of the outseam and inseam on both legs. I'm using a long stitch length because that makes it easier to pick things apart and alter them. I pressed open the seams on my sleeve board, but a rolled up towel works if you don't have one. I turned one leg right side out, put it inside the other leg, and pinned and sewed the crotch seam, this time with a somewhat shorter stitch length. I clipped the curves and pressed the seam open, and it was ready to try on. Inside out, so I can get at the seam allowances. Pinning the top of the side seam closed was still surprisingly awkward. The waistline was sitting just a smidge lower than my natural waist, so I'm raising it by 1.5 centimeters, which I'm marking on the seam allowance. My final pants pattern will not have a dart in the front, so I ripped one of them out and pinned the same amount of fullness out of the side. These are a bit tighter across the backside than I would prefer, so I'm also going to add a little bit to the edge of the back piece, just curving out that very straight side seam a bit, since the front is so much more curved in that area. I marked a comfortable size for a pocket opening I can fit my hand into, but in hindsight this was not necessary because I can just do that on the pattern paper. I also tried on one of my shortest waistcoats and traced the bottom edge, so I can make sure none of the eventual waistband will show. The hem was a little too long, so I scooched that up a bit higher. I ripped out the other front dart and the top of the side seam and marked on the changes. After re-sewing that side seam and trying it on again, making sure to pin the other side closed along the new lines, I can now transfer those changes onto the pattern. I taped a scrap of paper to the top of the front piece and drew on a new top line 1.5 centimeters above the old one. I marked the width and length of the dart fullness on the side seam so I could remove that fullness, smoothing it out to match the rest of the curve better. The way I did it here does make the top of the waist a little bit narrower, but it was okay. I cut the excess off either side, but I'm not cutting off the top yet. I also had to tape down the edges of all these extra paper scraps on the other side. On the back piece, I taped scraps onto both the side and the top, and added 1.5 centimeters to the top again. This time I'm keeping the dart, and marking the 3 points on the new top edge. I drew a bit more width on the side of the hip, according to what I'd marked on the mock-up, and once again cut off the extra paper from the side and crotch seams. I folded the back dart and smoothed out that line once again. I laid the pieces next to each other at the side seam and smoothed out that angle into a curve. I also noticed the center back was at a slightly obtuse angle, so I squared up the corner. I cut along the new top line, keeping the dart folded. I taped small scraps over the punched holes at the bottom and drew a new hemline 2.5 centimeters higher than the old one, since that's how much I folded up on the mock-up. I lined up the side and inseams to smooth out the areas where they connect, because the legs taper a bit, which means the bottoms meet at a slight angle. I cut those edges and punched new holes. I then trued the pattern pieces again, which maybe I should have done before I finished cutting, but oh well. The inseam still matched up fine, because nothing had been done to it. The side seam alterations were a bit more drastic at the top, so I trued it from the bottom, and it was a few millimeters off at the top. I trimmed off that tiny bit of extra, and now I have a fitted basic pant block. But one does not sew a functional pair of pants from a basic block pattern. It needs other bits, like a waistband and pockets. My regular everyday pants, which I've been making and wearing for years, don't fit very well in the waist. Most of my wardrobe is some degree of 18th century inspired, and I prefer to make my waistbands fasten the same way as the ones on 18th century breeches. They have a buttoned fall front and a lacing gap in the center back, and that's all fine. My problem is that I've been using the same straight waistband shape as all those pattern diagrams, even though my waist is very much not shaped like that. All those extant breeches were made to fit fairly rectangular hips, but mine curve a significant amount, and those very wide rectangles I've been stubbornly using for years just do not work on me. In addition to the hips, I'm pretty short-waisted, so there's only a very narrow gap between my ribs and pelvis where the smallest part of my waist is, and all the waistband material wants to go there, so they scrunch up and get all bunchy and wrinkly. It looks bad and it makes them less comfortable, so I'm finally going to start using curved waistband pieces. I should also consider making some slight changes to my breeches pattern, but that's not relevant to my everyday pants, which are not meant to be accurate to any era. My end goal is a pattern with a fall front closure, buttoned corner pockets, and a waistband with a lacing gap in the center back. It will also have some gathering on the back, like 18th century breeches do, but I forgot to draw the gathering at first and had to film this clip several days later. Anyone wanting a fly front closure will have to look elsewhere for drafting instructions, but they're easy enough. You mostly just draw a big lowercase j. Before making changes to a pattern block, it's always best to make a new copy, so you still have the old one on hand. I'm still using markers for visibility on camera, but you should be using pencils in real life. The grain lines and darts and any other markings must also be transferred to the new pattern. Since I don't want my waistband to show under any of my waistcoats, I'm referencing that line I drew on the mock-up, and making the bottom edge of the waistband just a centimeter or so higher than that. That meant I had a 4 centimeter waistband, which I think is a pretty reasonable width. The back of the waistband starts off as two curved sections because of the dart, but I'm not going to have a dart in the final pattern, so I'll have to get rid of that fullness. I cut the waistband off the top, cut along one side of the dart, and taped that part of the dart closed. I need that lacing gap to help make it more adjustable, so I'm shaving 1.5 centimeters off the center back edge and rounding off that top corner a little bit. Now I should be able to take it in 3 centimeters if necessary by tightening the lacing. I cut out the front half of the waistband, and this time I need to add length to the center front edge, because I need a button overlap. Should have done this before cutting out the front of the waistband, but sometimes brains just don't work, so I had to tape an extra bit on. I did 1.5 centimeters for this too, to give me a 3 centimeter overlap. I still need to smooth out the top of the back piece because I don't want that dart there. I want gathers. So I'm taping a bit of paper under there and doing it wrong the first time around. Please don't watch that. I should not be adding height to both of those inward curves. I should only be adding it to the one closer to the center back. What I'm going for is a much milder version of this sort of curve, so I should not be adding too much to the part near the side seam. I added just a tiny little bit since these won't fit like breeches and I don't want the back to puff out. I wanted a bit more flare at the bottoms, so I added 5 millimeters to each side of the hems, adding up to 2 more centimeters of circumference. The second pattern I'm going to draft is a lot more tightly fitted, so I figured I'd make these a bit looser. Then I cut out the rest of the pattern. Then I made another copy of the front, and the other one will come back later. I want a narrow fall front, like the ones on these pants I made a few years ago. After measuring this fall, I drew the line for my new one 10 centimeters from the center front edge, keeping it parallel with the straight section at the top of the crotch seam. I need the fall to stick up high enough so that the button for the corner can be sewn to the waistband, so I looked at a button blank of about the right size and added 2 centimeters to the top of the fall. From the top of the fall to the bottom of the placket opening is 13 centimeters on these pants, and I marked this one about 13.5 centimeters down from the top of the fall, just in case they've shrunk in the wash. Now I had to add the protruding bit for the corner pocket. These are a common feature in 18th century breeches, and I love them. They look pretty cool, and they help to keep things from falling out. I'm using another button blank to visualize where to put the button, and I made sure to mark an opening wide enough to fit my hand. I drew that pocket extension on with a straight line on the side and a slight inward curve on the top. I drew on roughly where I want the buttonhole to be and cut the whole thing out. I used the notcher to mark holes where necessary, and I must note here that I'm going to go back and mark a second line where the placket opening is, but I didn't realize I should do that till a bit later. Now I'm drawing a placket for the edges of the fall. I think it would be easier to just put a diagram on screen of what my final placket piece looks like. I've put this in the same folder as the drafting instructions, which is linked in the description. The pointy side is the bit that's visible on the outside, and it has to be long enough to cover up the rest of the placket, so it's 1.5 centimeters longer than the other 3 sections, plus a little pointy bit at the end that adds another 1.3 centimeters. The bit next to it is about the same width, or a little narrower, and gets folded under. The narrow piece next to that is where it gets cut open, as you can see from the dotted line, and the outer narrow piece goes on the other edge of the opening. I went back and widened it a bit after sewing up the first pair, so these are all the final measurements. The one I'm drawing on screen here is a little narrower. In case I didn't explain the placket well enough in the voiceover, this part is this part. It needs to be tall enough to go to the top of the fall, not this, which is lower. This part is this part. This part's where it's cut open, so that little bottom bit there is this little edge here. And this part is that part. Now I need to make a fall lining, so I'm tracing the top of the fall and the crotch seam and marking through the hole on the bottom of the line for the placket. Then I just need to draw in that line and angle down towards the center front, so the full thing is pointed like this. Now I'm making pocket bags for those corner pockets. I traced that corner of the front pattern piece and marked the notches. I drew a line 1 centimeter out from the placket mark, which is the edge of where the placket opening will be, and I'm going to be sure to stay far away from it so my pockets won't get in the way of the plackets. I drew on a pocket bag that's not huge, but big enough. After cutting out and notching it, I traced another copy, and brought back my plain copy of the pants front so I could trace the non-protruding corner on, for the inner half of the pocket bag. The reason I made a copy of the front lining before adding the corner pocket is because if I ever want to make a fully lined pair of pants with this pattern, I will need the unaltered corner. I will need this piece for the lining. For an unlined pair, I'll just use the fall lining, but for a fully lined pair, I'll have to have this for the front lining, and I will have to add the little extension to the top of the fall. But for the corner pocket, I've got the extension bit on the outside fabric and the front half of the pocket, and then I've got the original corner on the inside half of the pocket and the lining. So outside fabric, front half of pocket, back half of pocket, lining. But if you don't want corner pockets, you can just use the plain front piece, trace the corner, and draw in a pocket bag here. I'm going to trace the back so I can make a backwards facing side seam pocket because I'm always worried about things falling out of my pockets, and the contents of a backwards pocket are not in danger when you sit down. It's a bit more awkward to reach into them, and they do sometimes get snagged on door latches, but some pairs of extant breeches have them, which is what gave me the idea in the first place. Next, I need to make the little wedge piece that goes in between the placket opening and the front part of the waistband, which I've seen some diagrams call the underfall. I marked the part of the waistband that will stick out past the placket opening and also marked the length of the line down the side of the fall. I'm starting this bottom piece just a little bit above that lower mark so it doesn't interfere with the corner, and drawing a diagonal line with curved ends. I drew this part at a right angle because that's the way it fits in between the fall and the waistband on my flat pattern, but I might need to change it later because on my old pattern when I made it a right angle, even though it was that way on the flat pattern, it didn't sit smoothly on me. It sort of gaped and bulged out this way, so I had to make this angle smaller, but I will have to wait and see how it goes after I sew it up. This one might just be a problem with my old waistband, and maybe it'll be fine this time. I marked the center front on this piece, and on the center back of the waistband I marked the locations of the eyelets for the lacing. Now I need to mark a little gap at the center back seam. The top of that seam has to stay open for the lacing, and I usually add a little wedge-shaped piece of fabric in there. Once again inspired by 18th century breeches. I'm just drawing a little triangle that goes from the bottom of this opening to almost the top of the waistband. Looks like I considered angling the sides in at the waistband, but decided against it and just cut out a straight-sided triangle with a curve on top. I did my grain lines and labeling and such, made some notches along the length of the legs, and trued them again so I could make corresponding notches for the other side of the seams. There must also be notches marking the lacing gap at the center back and the pocket opening. Here I'm taping on the fall extension to the top of the plain front piece because I foolishly traced this copy before adding the fall. And here is my finished pattern, all ready to sew up. I made up the first pair in a brownish stash cotton, and I did indeed have to adjust the angle of the underfall. It was gaping the same way my previous pattern had done, so it wasn't just a problem with that waistband. I pinched out the excess and pinned it and made sure it was no longer gaping. I marked the right amount of material I needed to exclude, and cut and overlapped my underfall pattern like so to remove that fullness. Of course, that added a slight angle to the previously straight diagonal edge, so I traced a new copy and straightened that out. Here it is, all fixed. As previously mentioned, I did also make my fall placket a bit wider because I think the narrowness of the outer placket was part of why the inner bit was showing so badly, but the measurements I already showed on screen are the final ones, so I don't think I need to go over that. But here's something I did neglect to do earlier. I'm marking on a second line next to the one I already made for the placket opening. On my previous patterns, which I made years ago, I'd only ever done one line for the place I sew on the fall placket. But since I sew a long U shape to attach the placket, it's only reasonable that I have 2 lines marked on the front of the pants to line up with the 2 stitching lines on the placket. After I'd worn this pair a few times, I noticed the waistband felt a bit too big, and it was sitting lower than I wanted it to. I tightened up the lacing as much as it would go, which helped, but I want to have a lacing gap in case I need to take them in more. I had already cut out the next version, so I removed a cumulative 3 centimeters from the back piece of the waistband interfacing before sewing it on, which I later did on the pattern piece too. Sometime later I also trimmed down part of the crotch seam, just a tiny bit, on both the lining and outer pieces of course. The second pair came out fine. The new waistband has a decent sized lacing gap and fits comfortably while still having room to expand, and the underfall is sitting much better. It is still gaping a little bit at one side, so I've decided next time I sew them up I'm changing the grain line. On these I have the grain going straight up and down, which puts the long edge on the bias, and even though there's a seam with top stitching there, it's probably stretching a little. I will try putting the grain line along this diagonal edge and see how that goes. And I've marked it on the pattern piece so I don't forget. And here is my entire pants pattern as it currently is. Not all these pieces can be used at once though. For a fully lined version with corner pockets I would use these, but for a fully lined version with backwards facing side seam pockets I'd use these. But if that version were unlined I'd need this piece too. You get the idea, there's a few different options. And you could modify the basic pants block in lots of other ways. Make it more flared, gather it into a little cuff at the ankle, add other kinds of pockets, or a zipper fly, or a button fly. But yes, that's the pants draft I learned in college, turned into the kind of 18th century inspired fall front pants I've been wearing every day for years now. These are not patterns you can modify to be 18th century breeches though. Neither of the ones in this video are. Those fit completely differently and you will need completely different shapes. Before I get to the next pattern, I should mention that I recently made a sketchbook tour video for Patreon. It's about 35 minutes and is in the $3 tier, and I will do another one once I filled up my current sketchbook. I don't make Patreon videos very often, but there are a few, and I do a monthly update post on all the video and sewing related stuff I've been working on, so people there get to see pictures of video projects quite a while before the video comes out, because I am very slow at making videos. I've also started letting patrons vote on which unfinished video I should finish next. I currently have 3 partially filmed, and Pants Drafting won the poll, so I'm finishing this one next. And I will finish the other 2 in the voted order before I make another poll. Thank you patrons for helping me pay for food and rent and vintage sewing machine parts. Also, the video polls are free. The other stuff is paywalled, but not the polls. You just need an account to vote. Getting back to the pants, this draft was recommended by a friend who has fairly similar proportions to me. It's from the 1917 book New Supreme System for Production of Men's Garments by Frederick T. Kronborg. Unlike the school draft, this one does include seam allowances. This book uses imperial measurements, and as a Canadian, I hate 1/8 and 16ths of an inch. I hate them so much. Whole inches are fine and useful for some things, but if you divide a larger measurement and get something that ends in a decimal, apparently you're just supposed to have memorized how to translate it into the repulsive little fractions. I don't know how anyone lives like that. I've been told that it makes a lot more sense if you only have a physical tape that you can keep folding in half, and that did really help me understand why it was invented. I'm sure it was totally fine before calculators existed, but if you are using a calculator, it's horrible. So unless I have a 0.25 or a 0.75, I will be ignoring all these smaller marks and simply rounding to the nearest tenth, and then eyeballing that tenth on the ruler. I am not accepting criticism on this particular point. On a slightly different topic, I used wrapping paper for this draft, and it was one of the ones with the grid on the back. I have seen so many well-meaning people in comment sections say that wrapping paper has an inch grid on the back, but I measured the ones I have and none of them are exactly an inch. Some were a little bit off and some were way smaller and not even square. So if people could stop saying that and just call it a grid, that would be nice. To be clear, I'm not annoyed at the wrapping paper companies, I'm annoyed at the misinformation. It's a small distinction, but people could be led to believe that they can just count the squares, because generally one expects an inch grid to be made of 1-inch squares. They are still useful for making sure your lines are squared up or parallel, but that's all. After recording that, I checked it with my retractable measuring tape, and it does actually line up with this one. Which is weird because it is so clearly off after just a short distance on this grid ruler. So I think the precise measurement on this ruler and this tape must be different. Oh dear, I don't know which one to trust. Who even decides what precisely an inch is? Point still stands about not trusting wrapping paper though, because this is nothing. Okay, time to take the measurements. The book describes taking measurements from someone already wearing pants, but for the sake of consistency and because my waistbands are all scrunched up and bulky, I'm going to take mine the same way as before, rounding to the nearest ½ inch. For the outside seam, I'm sticking the tape to my ankle bone and measuring up to the waist while standing, same as before, 42 inches. For the inseam, in school we were taught that the proper and polite way to take an inseam measurement is to lift up the measuring tape on a pencil like this. So I'm taping it to the ankle bone on the inside of my foot and doing it that way. 31.5. The waist is the same as before, 37 inches. And the seat is the same as the hip measurement from last time, 44 inches. The book says to take that one standing with the heels close together, but I tried it both ways and there was no difference. For the knee measurement, the book says it will vary according to style and taste. I want these pants to be more tightly fitted than the previous draft, so I only gave it a little extra room, but it's still loose enough to get my calf through. 17 inches. The bottom, or hem circumference, also varies. I made it just big enough to slip my foot through. 13.5 inches. The book then says you must note any of what they call variations from normal. For me, I am noting that I have a rather large backside and hips, and that the knee measurement is a little snug on the flexed calf. The draft I did was this one for proportionate trousers, but they do have other versions, including a specifically plus-sized one they call corpulent trousers. As mentioned in the intro, I messed up a few things on this one. Even though I know perfectly well that if you're going to draft a pattern from a book this old, you should at least read the introductory chapters before starting, I did not do that. I just wanted to get the drafting done so I could move on to the sewing, and so I missed the very important fact that for all the calculations involving torso circumference, they're only using half the total measurement. So instead of using 37 for the waist and 44 for the seat, I should have been using 18.5 and 22. I did not notice the problem when I was doing the calculations because I'm not used to inches, so just at a casual glance, these numbers don't mean anything to me. But once I got far enough into the drafting process, it was pretty clear that something was wrong, and once I learned of my mistake, I corrected those two measurements and started over again. So here I am starting my new draft on the remaining half of the piece of paper I cut. Much like the rectangle in the other draft, this one starts with an L-shaped line. The shorter one along the top of the pants isn't specified since it's just a straight line to follow, but A to B is the outseam measurement of 42 inches. From B back up to C is the inseam length. C to D is half the inseam, which is 15.75 inches. Then from D we go a standard 2 inches back up to E. It's nice to have the instructions printed out so you can mark which steps you've done to help minimize confusion. From C up to N is 1/6 the seat, which is 3.6 inches. Then we need to square up the lines N, C, E, and B. C to F is half the seat, which is 1/4 of the entire seat since we're working with halves, 11 inches. Half an inch further out from F is G, and then G to H is 1/12 the seat, which is 1.8 inches. From H we go out another 3/4 of an inch to I. J is halfway between C and H, so I just folded the tape to get that. Now J needs to be squared up, and the place where it meets the top line is K. On the waistline, K to L and K to M are each 1/4 of the waist, which is 4.6 inches. Down at the hem, B to P is 1/3 the seat, so that's 7.3 inches. I did the next couple of steps out of order from how they're written, but P to R and P to S are both 1/4 of the hem circumference, which is 3.4 inches. Then I have to draw a long straight line from P up to J, and the place where it crosses that knee line is Q. Q to T and Q to U are each 1/4 of the knee measurement, so 4.25 inches. Then I have to join R and T with a straight line and make 2 more lines joining C, U, and S. Next I draw a line from G to L and another from F to L. O is the point where the F to L line crosses the line squared out from N. Now I draw another line from N to M and smooth out that hip area to be more rounded. Here I also mistakenly added some width to the calf, but if you look at the diagram, it's only on the back piece, so just ignore that. I will notice my mistake and cut it off later. For the crotch seam, I sketched out a smooth curve in pen and did the same for the inward curve at the top of the inseam, using a straight line as a guide. I made sure that corner was at a right angle. For the shaped hem at the bottom, you go 3/4 of an inch up from P and draw a smooth curve down to the sides. Now the front piece is all done and can be cut out, though as I mentioned I shouldn't have that extra width on the calf of the front piece. I did go back and cut it off, but that was much later in the process. I messed up my back piece on the first attempt and had to redo it too. I was getting very confused and frustrated because the instructions were referencing marks on the top that I didn't know how to get because I didn't know what sweep out meant. This was once again the fault of my not having read the rest of the book. I was also a bit annoyed at how grainy my printout was because some of the letters were hard to read, so I switched to looking at the diagram on my laptop. My printer was only $8 at an estate sale, so it's no surprise that it's not very good. Anyways, here is me starting on the correct version of the backdraft, and just like before, we start by tracing the front and marking on all those lines and letters. I'm leaving the front piece here for the moment so I can reference some of the marks on it. The first instruction is to sweep forward from I, pivoting at T, and it turns out what that means is use a bit of string with the end held down at the pivot point and draw an arc like so. Next I need to pivot at U to sweep out from C. Up at the top I need to use F as a pivot point and sweep up from M. And then using C as a pivot point I sweep back from M this way. Then I found the next instruction a bit confusing, so I skipped ahead to some easier ones. The lines at the knee and the hem both need to be extended out ½ an inch on each side. So that's R to 2, S to 3, T to 4, and U to 5, all ½ an inch. I to V is 1/12 the seat, along that line made by sweeping out. That's 1.8 inches. I marked the wrong letters on these, so I went back and fixed them. Next it says to place the corner of the square ruler on O with the long arm resting on C and square up from O to Y. Not having the kind of square shown in the diagram, I had to do this with a quilting square and 2 rulers. Here I had to move the front piece out of the way to trace the line on the back piece. O to W is 1/6 the seat, which is 3.6 inches. Then from W we square back, and W to X is half the seat, so 11 inches. X to 7 is another 1 3/4 inches. Then 5 and 7 are joined with a line. And now I finally get back to that earlier step I skipped, which is run a line from 8 to Y along the sweep lines as shown. This one was very hard to see on my grainy printout, but by zooming in on the computer I saw that it meant to draw a line right along the topmost points of those 2 arcs. The crests or peaks, I suppose. Y to Z is 1 inch, and Z to 8 is half the seat, so 11 inches again. Now I join up the rest of the side seam. For the bottom part, the line is supposed to end halfway between 3 and S, so the finished line can go back out to 3 for that little bit of flare. We're also told to add 1/4 inch to the side of the calf. And it's pretty much the same on the other side of the leg, drawing the bottom of the inseam from 4 down to halfway between R and 2, and then flaring the line back out to 2. And here I somehow forgot to add the extra curve to the other edge of the calf and went straight on to shaping the top of the inseam. Then the shaped hem continues with a little downward dip for the back piece, the middle of which is 3/4 of an inch down from the straight line. Back up at the top, Z to 9 is half the waist, which is 9.25 inches. Now we've got some extra material between 9 and 8, and I think the instructions are telling me to take it out in a dart, but I appear to be mistakenly curving the side in. Ignore that. 8 to 11 is 1/6 the seat, which is 3.6 inches. And 11 to 10 is 1 inch. Now I need my front to see where J is, so I can draw a line from 11 to J. I found J with the end of my ruler and moved the front piece out from under it to draw it on. And I drew a dart on there the same way it's done in the diagram. I smoothed out the crotch seam, or crutch as the book calls it. Then I cut out the back piece, still somehow forgetting that shaping on the other side of the calf. Just like before, I folded the dart before cutting out the waist. Besides the lack of precision, one thing I don't like about drafting with markers is how much ink gets on the rulers and on your hands. I cleaned all the edges off with an alcohol swab. I had to put my quilting frame on top of boxes to get the camera high enough to get the whole draft in frame. And now I'm going to take it all down because it is very much in the way. Next I trued the seams, and this time it was the front piece that was a bit too long and needed trimming. I notched the darts and put some balance marks on the seams, as usual, and punched holes for hanging. The friend who recommended this pattern told me it has a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and comparing them to the previous draft, these pieces are bigger around altogether. The front's a bit smaller, but the back is much bigger. I'm mocking this one up in some thrifted polycotton. Normally it's good to leave larger seam allowances on a mock-up in case you need to let it out, but I cut this one right on the tracing line to avoid confusion. This was a good opportunity to try this seam guide I've had for years but never used, so I screwed that down to the machine bed and set it to 1/4 inch. Then I pinned the seams without thinking and had to repin them because seam guides don't like perpendicular pins. There are so many things in this video where I know how to do them, but I simply did not think. I sewed it up just like the previous mock-up, leaving the side open so I could put it on more easily. The fit wasn't bad, but it was too loose around the waist. The waist was also a little bit too short. I pinched a bit of width out of the sides and back. And tried to mark where to lower the back of the waistline because it was sloped up much higher than the front. The calf area felt a bit too tight, and it looked like it needed more room on the side seam than on the inseam, almost as if I'd forgotten to add extra width to that side, so I circled the area that felt tightest with a marker. Since I'm used to working with no seam allowance, I started off my pattern modifications by tracing a line 1/4 inch in from the edge of the side, inseam, and crotch. While doing that, I smoothed out some of the more angular areas, like this bit on the knee. On the calf, I used that 1/4 inch margin to draw the side out a bit rounder. I trimmed off that 1 centimeter I'd pinched out of the side seams. I'd also pinned about 3 centimeters total out of the back, so I added 1.5 centimeters to each of the darts. I should note that ideally you'd want to add the width equally to each side of the dart, but I'm going to turn the darts into gathers, so I don't think it matters here. And I'm lowering the center back, swooping that down towards the dart in a nice curve. After trimming off the side and crotch seam allowances, I retrued the pattern and had to cut a little bit of length off the back of the hem. The top of the side seam was now meeting at an awfully sharp angle, so I had to tape in a couple of small scraps to round it out. I made a waistband, but instead of cutting it off the top like on the last pattern, I traced the top and added 4 centimeters of height onto it. The mock-up had been a bit too short, but this was more height than I needed, and I also don't know what I was thinking continuing that side seam angle up, because that's going to make the waist smaller. Maybe I was planning ahead for the lacing gap? I didn't take any notes while doing this part, and it's been long enough that I just don't remember. I made a second mock-up using a different thrifted polycotton, and I made the waistband from 2 layers of cotton muslin. This time I left the opening in the center front, since I already knew the front fit smoothly. The first time I tried this one on, the waistband felt too tight, and it was still a bit snug after I cut the back open to account for the lacing gap. But this was in the evening, right after having a lot of food and water, so the next day I tried it on before eating, and it felt fine. The human body is frustratingly inconsistent. I figured I'd split the difference and let the waist out just a tiny little bit in the next version. The top of the waistband was sitting too high, so I lowered it by 1 centimeter. This fabric has basically no stretch, and the butt felt lacking in room when I bent my legs or sat down, so I added a small amount of height to the back. The calves still felt too tight, so I drew and sewed those lines a bit further out and pulled out the old stitching on both sides of the calf. Then it felt much better. Writing down all the changes you make to a pattern is a good thing to do, and I usually don't bother, but I did try to do it for this one. I drew a little diagram and marked on all the changes I had to make to my pattern after the second mock-up. This goes on the shower hook with the pattern. I traced a new copy of the pattern to make my changes on. Almost forgot to mark the grain lines on, and then when I did I realized I'd done the back one wrong and had to fix it. I traced the front waistband right onto the top of the front, but the back one had to be separate from the back due to the dart. Those calf edges are supposed to curve out the same on both sides, but they're not doing that. I think I must have accidentally cut this one off while I was cutting it out. No, you forgot to add it in the first place. I am adding 5 millimeters back under the top of both edges of the side seam on both the main pieces and the waistband. And lowering the top line of that waistband by 1 centimeter. On the front I can easily lower the bottom edge by 1 centimeter, like so, but on the back piece I have to add the centimeter to the bottom of the waistband and lower the top of the back piece separately. But I do also have to add some height to the center back, because as mentioned it didn't feel like there was enough material vertically to comfortably bend my legs. It might seem weird that I lowered the waist and then raised it again, but it does make sense because I wanted the waistband to have that lower curve around the back. And I added this extra room to the pants underneath the waistband, so the waistband still has that nice even curve along the back. I think the waistband would have sat too high in the back if I just kept it at the same height, because of course the waistband is stiffer than the rest of the pants. I added slightly more than 1 centimeter, so the center back ended up being a little bit higher than the traced edge of the first version. I added some more width onto the calves on both the front and back pieces, and started cutting things out and labeling them. I trued the side seams again, and then made another copy in a heavier brown paper to alter into a fall front pattern. The 3 centimeter overlap in the other pairs of pants had seemed like a bit too much, so instead of adding 1.5 centimeters to the center front waistband, I only added about 12 millimeters. I curved off that top corner and the one on the center back too. Here's the full waistband. On my other pattern I did a fairly narrow fall, but on this one I wanted a broad fall. So instead of having plackets, the entire top of the front is the fall, like on this pair of breeches I made many years ago. The fall has corner buttons, a lot like the ones for the pockets on the other one, and also a center front buttonhole that buttons to the waistband. These will need a larger underfall piece than the others did. I'm tracing the top of the front piece and marking on that 12mm center front extension because it needs to match up with the waistband. I measured the split on the sides of my old breeches and they're about 12 centimeters. You can figure this stuff out with a mock-up if you haven't already got something with a fall front, but I already know these open a good amount, so it's easier just to measure them. I want the edge of my underfall to extend a bit lower than the split, so the lower mark is the bottom of the piece and the mark above that is where the side seam will open. At first I just drew a narrow front edge, but then I realized it would be more secure if I had a couple of buttons on the underfall too, so I made the center front of that as wide as the waistband. I drew a little horizontal line and a big diagonal line like so and rounded the corners. And I also want a bit of a facing on that side seam so I don't have to use outer fabric for the entire piece. I marked on a vertical grain line, but then I worried that this diagonal bias edge would stretch and make the sides gape like it did on the other pants. So I cut in towards the top side seam corner and overlapped it to take out about 3 or 4 millimeters at the bottom. Nothing too dramatic, I just wanted it smaller than the outer layer of the pants. So then I redrew the facing line and cut out and notched all the things. Then I remembered I should have a lining piece because I don't need a facing on the inner layer of the underfall, so I did that. And because this pattern has no other pockets, I figured I may as well add a small one to the underfall, right in the seam between that piece and the waistband. Then I made another copy of the front piece so I could add the necessary extensions to the top. The top of the center front buttonhole needs to line up with the lower button on the front of the waistband. I put the top of that buttonhole 1 centimeter up from the waist seam and the top of the front piece another centimeter above that. I continued that 2 centimeter extension along the rest of the top edge, and then marked on the line from the underfall, indicating where the sides will open. I sketched on the button location and angled out the corner just like I did on the pockets for the first pair. And drew on the angle of the buttonhole. This kind of front needs to have either a facing around the whole edge or a partial lining, or a full lining. Most of the pants I alter at work have a partial lining, and I'd never made one before, so I figured I'd try it for these. I traced the top of the front and tried to draw a horizontal cutoff line while viewing it from the side, but once I marked the grain line on, I could see it was very crooked and I had to even it up. Now I've got a front lining piece that ends above the knee. I'm going to make one of these for the other pattern too. I also made a couple of facing pieces as a different option, though I don't think I will use these unless the fabric is very, very thick. They've got gaps in the center front and corner seams to line up with the buttonholes. The main front piece and the lining piece also have a little gap in the center front, so there's no need to cut a buttonhole, you just don't sew up that part of the seam. Marked on the lacing gap, and this time I'm doing a shorter triangle that doesn't go higher than the waistband. This hem is very curvy, so it needs facings too. I just traced the bottoms and made them 3 centimeters wide. I sewed up a wearable version in this greenish grey cotton twill, and the waist feels pretty good. The angle of the underfall seems to have worked out well. The corner buttons are a little bit too high, but not enough to motivate me to move them. The front lies smoothly, and I can reach into the pocket. I didn't put the bulk of the gathers far enough back on the right side, and it's causing a bit of wrinkling, but that's not a problem with the pattern itself. Although I should mark the area to be gathered on the back piece. The knees feel a bit snug when I sit down, but I think that's just because I'm not used to wearing tight pants. They're too long though. I don't want my pants to crumple over the top of my foot, especially not these ones with the shaped hems. I found the intersection of the waistband side seams and the edge of the underfall to be awfully bulky while sewing. I was hesitant to get rid of the waistband side seam altogether because the waistband is so curved, and if I cut the center front on grain, the center back would be completely on the bias, which would make it prone to stretching out and deforming. So I decided to keep the separate pieces for the interfacing and make a single piece for just the lining and outer fabric. I'll see how I feel about it next time I sew it up, and I may also try shifting the side seam on the waistband further back. That way I'd be able to cut both ends on the straight grain, but the bulk from the waistband side seam would be in a different place from the pant side seam. I'm shortening the hem by 1.5 centimeters after taping those hanging holes closed. And I'm also smoothing out the curves across the side seams because apparently I forgot to do that when I was truing the pattern and it looks pretty bad on paper. After shortening and smoothing out the hems, I made new facing pieces. And here's the complete pattern. I ended up with an extra copy of my basic front piece, which is not useful for this pattern, but I can always use it in another version if I want to. Here are all the pieces I'd need for doing a fully lined version, but if I was only using the partial front lining or the facing, I'd need the bottom facings too. One piece that I haven't made but that is an option is this sort of reinforcement patch thingy that goes over the intersection of the crotch seams. The pants I alter at work have it, and it's a separate piece that's tacked onto the seam allowances. I think if I were to add one, I'd make it a bit more diamond shaped. I might make some more small tweaks to the patterns as I sew more pants, but I'm pretty happy with the way they are right now. It was annoying trying to get the waistbands to fit, and I think it might be nice to try taking the waist measurement several times over the course of a day, so you could get the average. I don't remember what time of day I took the measurements, but there was a significant amount of difference between trying on the mock-ups in the morning and the evening. I do like my pants to be just a little bit higher waisted, but since the top is already at the narrowest part of my waist, I don't see how I could do that with a regular waistband. If I wanted to make the waistband taller without having it scrunch up, I'd have to make it dip in and flare back out again like a little underbust corset, which seems like an awful lot of effort for pants, especially considering how quickly my inseams wear out from walking. I guess I could also do suspenders. I wouldn't want to do either of those things for my regular everyday pants though, so I'll just have to be okay with waistbands that are a couple centimeters shorter than what I'm used to. Also, I did get a 4-foot long straight edge after recording the rest of this video. It's only got imperial markings, which feels like it shouldn't be allowed, but I just want it for drawing lines, so I don't mind too much. As I said in the intro, I'm not used to drafting patterns this way, and I made quite a few mistakes that I had to go back and fix, but I still ended up with patterns that fit. The first pairs of pants would have been better if I'd put more details into my actual mock-ups, but I think wearable mock-ups are a good use for stash materials that you don't like all that much. Or for two different but very similar pieces of thrifted corduroy that are only big enough for one leg each. Do not expect any more basic block drafting videos from me. I don't really have a use for a basic bodice or a sleeve block. One of my goals this year is to make more pants, and now I've made 3 pairs and they all used up stash material, so that's nice. I did not film the sewing of any of these pants though. I will make a pants video at some point, but I haven't started yet, and as mentioned, I still have 2 partially filmed videos to finish. I do know which fabric I want to use for the pants video though. I guess I'll have to make 2 pants videos eventually because I did 2 different fall front styles that are not constructed in the same way. The order of operations is very different from a fly front. On these fall front ones, you've got to sew the front crotch seam first before any other seams. I do at least have a blog post on sewing the first style of fall with the plackets, so I'll put that in the description. I hope this video was interesting, and I hope the drafting did not come across as scary. I also hope that if you try out a historical drafting book, you read the whole thing first. I knew I should have done that, and I didn't, and it did not save me time. Okay, that's all for now. Bye!